This is Olympus Dreams, where old stories quiet the mind. Now, let the world beyond your window fade. We're going somewhere older. The island rises from the sea like a memory half forgotten. Crete, they call it, bronze beneath the sun, violet in the evening light. The Mediterranean laps at its shores with the patience of something that has witnessed civilizations rise and crumble and rise again. Here, where Europe meets Africa in warm water and salt wind, the palace of Knossos spreads across the hillside like a story told in stone. This is long ago, before Athens became marble, before Rome was even a shepherd's thought. In these days, Crete is the heart of the world, and Knossos its brightest jewel. The palace does not rise in a single mass, but sprawls. Courtyards open onto corridors, corridors bend into chambers. Chambers lead to staircases that descend and climb and turn back upon themselves in ways that make visitors walk slowly, one hand trailing the painted walls for guidance. Frescoes bloom everywhere. Dolphins leap in cerulean waves. Bull dancers frozen mid-vault, graceful as birds. Lilies and saffron and octopi with curling arms. In the great courtyard, the western light turns everything gold. Servants move through shadows carrying amphorae of wine and oil. The scent of baking bread drifts from somewhere deep in the palace complex. Olive trees, ancient even then, stand in massive clay vessels, their silver leaves whispering in the evening breeze. A cat, tawny and lean, picks its way across sun-warmed stones, pausing to lick one paw before continuing its private business. This is a place of abundance, of culture. The ships that crowd the harbor below bring cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, ivory from distant Africa. They carry away the palace's famous pottery, its saffron, its purple-dyed cloth that costs more than gold. Trade routes stretch like threads across the known world, and all of them, in one way or another, lead here. King Minos rules from a throne room decorated with griffins. He is not young, but neither is he old. His beard is still dark, threaded only lightly with silver. His eyes are sharp with the kind of intelligence that built empires from fishing villages. Under his governance, Crete has known peace. The granaries are full. The harbors are safe. Pirates dare not trouble his waters, for his fleet is vast and his justice swift. His wife, Queen Pasiphae, moves through the palace like light itself. She is the daughter of Helios, the sun god, though she never speaks of this. In her veins runs ichor mixed with mortal blood, that dangerous combination that marks certain people for fate's particular attention. She is clever. She reads. She studies the stars and the old medicines. The palace physicians consult her before they prescribe treatments. Children love her because she remembers their names, even the servants' children, and asks about their games. Together, Minos and Pasiphae have built something rare, a marriage of equals. 4 children, healthy and bright. A kingdom prosperous enough that other rulers send their sons here to learn statecraft. It should be enough. By any reasonable measure, it is more than enough. But the gods, of course, are never reasonable. On this particular evening, as twilight deepens and the first stars prick through the darkening sky, Minos stands on a balcony overlooking the sea. Behind him, the palace settles into its nightly routines. Lamps are being lit. Musicians tune their lyres in the great hall where dinner will be served. Somewhere, his youngest daughter is probably avoiding her bedtime, and Pasiphae is probably pretending not to notice. Minos watches the horizon where sea meets sky in a line so perfect it might have been drawn with a ruler. The water is dark now, the color of wine, and the last light catches the wave-tops and turns them briefly silver. A fishing boat makes its slow way back toward harbor, its day's work done. The king's hand rests on the balcony's stone rail, warm still from the afternoon sun. His signet ring, heavy gold carved with the labyrinth pattern that marks all official palace seals, catches the lamp glow from the room behind him. He turns it absently with his thumb, a habit he's had for years. He is thinking about his brothers, about the succession dispute that followed their father's death, about how he claimed the throne not through violence, though he could have, but through a sign from the gods. He had prayed to Poseidon there on the beach with witnesses gathered. He had asked for proof of divine favor, and from the waves had come the bull. White as sea foam, massive as storm clouds, walking through the surf as if the water were solid ground. Everyone had seen it. No one could deny his right after that. The bull was proof. A gift from the god of the sea himself, marking Minos as the chosen king. That was years ago now. The bull lives still in the royal pastures, tended by special herdsmen, fed on barley and apples. Minos visits it sometimes. It has never grown old, never sickened. Its coat remains impossibly white, its eyes deep and dark as the ocean floor. When it looks at him, the king sometimes feels it sees more than an animal should. A servant appears in the doorway behind him, hesitant to interrupt. Minos turns, shaking off his thoughts. "Dinner is ready," the servant says. "The queen is waiting." The king nods, takes a last look at the darkening sea, and follows the servant inside. The stone corridors are cool after the day's heat. His footsteps echo softly. The palace seems to breathe around him, alive with the small sounds of habitation. Distant laughter. The clatter of dishes. A dog barking somewhere in the courtyards below. In the great hall his family is gathered. The children are arguing, gently, about something trivial. Pacifier meets his eyes across the room and smiles, that small, private smile that still, after all these years, makes him grateful. The table is laid with bread and cheese, roasted fish and olives, wine mixed with water in the proper proportions. This is peace. This is what he built when he took the throne, a place where children can argue about nothing, and wives can smile, and bread is always warm, and the ships come heavy laden into safe harbors. Outside, night settles fully over the island. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The sea whispers against the shore in rhythms older than language. And in the royal pastures, the white bull lies down in clean straw, its dark eyes open, watching nothing. Watching everything. In the palace, no one yet knows that this peace is borrowed. That divine gifts always, always come with conditions attached. That broken promises echo louder in heaven than they do on earth. But time will teach them. Time always does. For now, there is only twilight fading, and a family at dinner, and an island floating in the dark sea like a jewel in a god's hand. The walls are strong. The granaries are full. Tomorrow the sun will rise on Crete again, as it always has. The story, like the labyrinth that doesn't yet exist, is only beginning to turn in on itself. The morning light comes softly through the palace windows, turning the frescoed dolphins a shade somewhere between blue and silver. The air is cool still, holding the memory of night, though soon the sun will climb and burn away all traces of that gentle darkness. In the kitchens far below, servants are already kneading dough. The smell of bread beginning its slow bake rises through the corridors like a benediction. Minos wakes early, as he always does. The habit of kingship rising before the realm. Beside him, Pacifier sleeps with one hand curled beneath her cheek, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled wine. He watches her for a moment, then rises quietly and dresses in the simple tunic he prefers for mornings, before the day demands ceremony. The balcony draws him again. Below, the island is waking. Smoke rises from cooking fires in the town. The harbor is already busy with fishermen preparing their boats, their voices carrying up the hillside in fragments of conversation. The sea stretches away toward horizons he has never visited, though ships bearing his seal travel there regularly. A servant brings bread and honey, a cup of water mixed with wine. Minos eats standing, still watching the water. There is something he needs to do today. Something he has been putting off, though he cannot say exactly why. The thought has been circling in his mind like a bird that will not land. The white bull, Poseidon's gift, the divine proof that secured his throne. He had promised, of course. One does not receive gifts from gods without acknowledgement. The terms were clear. The bull was to be sacrificed in Poseidon's honor, a great public offering that would sanctify Minos' kingship and bind the island to the sea god's favor. The ceremony should have happened years ago. The altars have been waiting. The priests know their parts by heart. But every time Minos considers it, something stops him. The bull is magnificent. Perfect. To kill it seems almost sacrilege, though the killing itself would be the sacred act. Other bulls could be sacrificed. He has herds of them, strong and healthy. Would the god really notice one bull among many? Would the difference matter to a being who commands all the oceans? These are the thoughts a king should not think. Minos knows this. Yet the thoughts persist, stubborn as barnacles on a ship's hull. He finishes his bread, drains the cup. The decision settles over him like a cloak. Today he will make the sacrifice, but not the white bull. A different one, equally fine, equally worthy. Poseidon will understand. Gods are not petty. They do not count individual animals like merchants counting coins. The rationalization feels thin even as he constructs it. But kings become skilled at believing what they need to believe. By midday, the sun has climbed to its highest point, and the palace stones radiate heat like coals in a banked fire. In the great courtyard, preparations begin for the ceremony. An altar has been built from blocks of dark stone, waist-high and broad enough to hold a full-grown bull. Priests in white robes move through their preparations with the careful precision of men who have performed these rites 100 times before. The bull chosen for sacrifice is led in by 2 strong herdsmen. It is a fine animal. Its coat is the color of wet earth, its horns curve like crescent moons, and its shoulders are thick with muscle. It walks calmly, unknowing. The crowd that has gathered to witness the ceremony murmurs approval. A worthy offering, a king's generosity made manifest. But in the royal pastures on the other side of the palace, the white bull stands alone. Its coat catches the sunlight and throws it back like polished marble. Its eyes, dark and fathomless, watch nothing. Or perhaps they watch everything. The other cattle give it space, as they always have. Something in them recognizes what they cannot name. This is not entirely an animal. This is a piece of the divine made flesh, walking on 4 hooves through ordinary grass. The ceremony proceeds as ceremonies do. The priests chant in the old tongue, words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Wine is poured, incense burns, sending up pale smoke that the wind carries away toward the sea. Minos stands at the center of it all, crowned and robed, playing the part of pious king. The knife is brought, ceremonial and ancient, its blade inscribed with prayers no one can quite translate anymore. The brown bull is led to the altar. It goes without resistance. Perhaps it senses nothing. Perhaps it has already left its body in the way animals sometimes do when the end approaches. The knife falls. Blood darkens the altar stones. The priests begin the prayers of offering, listing Minos' accomplishments, praising Poseidon's power over wave and storm and the creatures that swim in darkness. From her window high in the palace, Pasiphae watches. She has seen such ceremonies before. They are part of the rhythm of palace life, like festivals and trade delegations and the endless diplomatic meals. But today, something feels different. The air itself seems to hold its breath. When the blood touches the altar, she sees a cloud pass across the sun, though the sky is cloudless. A trick of light, perhaps. Or perhaps not. The ceremony ends. The carcass is carried away to be butchered and distributed among the people, as is proper. The priests bow and withdraw. The crowd disperses, talking among themselves, satisfied with their king's piety. Minos removes his crown and hands it to a servant. His head aches faintly. Too much sun. Too much wine on an empty stomach. He does not look toward the sea as he returns to the palace. If he had, he might have noticed how still the water has become, how the fishing boats have all turned toward shore, though the day is only half finished. How the gulls have stopped their crying. In the depths below the waves, in halls of coral and pearl where sunlight fails and pressure would crush mortal bones like eggshells, Poseidon knows. Of course he knows. Gods are not fooled by substitutions. They notice when promises are broken, when fear or greed or simple human weakness makes mortals think themselves clever. The god's anger is not hot. It is cold and patient as the deep ocean currents that move mountains of water without ever touching the surface. He does not rage. He does not storm. He simply considers what payment will be required. What lesson must be taught to a king who thinks himself wise enough to cheat the divine? Poseidon is lord of earthquakes as well as oceans. He could split Crete in half with a thought, but that would be crude. Quick, forgettable. No, this requires something more lasting, something that will echo through generations. A punishment that will teach not just Minos, but every king who comes after him. The god smiles in the darkness of his underwater palace. He knows exactly what to do. On Olympus, where the air is thin and the light falls differently than it does in mortal lands, Aphrodite is playing dice with her son. She wins, as she always does, though whether through skill or divine manipulation, even Eros cannot say. When she feels Poseidon's intention ripple through the fabric of fate, she laughs. It is not a kind sound. She has never liked mortal arrogance. And she has always enjoyed when the other gods provide her with opportunities for mischief. This situation, she thinks, has wonderful potential. A proud king, a devoted queen, a sacred bull that should have died but lives. Yes, she can work with this. She whispers something to her son. Eros listens, then grins. His arrows are already strung. In Crete, evening comes again. The palace settles. Children are fed and put to bed. Servants bank the fires. Pacifier walks through the garden where jasmine blooms in the darkness, releasing its heavy scent. She cannot shake the feeling that something has shifted. The stones beneath her feet feel less solid than they did yesterday. She looks up at the stars, reading them as her father Helios taught her. The patterns are the same as always, but the space between the stars seems somehow darker tonight. Deeper. As if the heavens have pulled away from the earth, leaving mortals more alone than they realized. In the pasture, the white bull lies down in clean straw. Its eyes remain open. Watching. Waiting. Above and below, the gods prepare their lessons. And in the palace, a family sleeps, not knowing that their peace has already ended. That the price of broken promises is being calculated. That some gifts, once given, can never be refused without consequence. The story turns. The labyrinth, not yet built, already begins to take shape in the mind of fate. The morning after the false sacrifice arrives like any other, which is how the most terrible days often begin. The sun rises over Crete in shades of rose and gold. Fishermen mend their nets along the shore. In the palace kitchens, servants grind grain for the day's bread. The world continues as if nothing has changed, because for most who live in it, nothing has. But in the queen's chambers, Pasiphae wakes from troubled sleep with a strange weight in her chest. She has dreamed of deep water and distant thunder, though she cannot remember the details. Only the feeling remains, like a bruise she cannot see. She rises, bathes in water scented with herbs, allows her maids to dress her in layers of linen, dyed the color of spring sky. Through it all, the weight does not lift. From her balcony she can see the pasture where the royal cattle graze. They cluster together at the far end, away from the white bull that stands alone near the stone wall. Its coat catches the early light like polished marble. Even from this distance she can see how it holds itself apart. Not with the nervousness of a frightened animal, but with something else. Dignity, perhaps. Or knowledge. She finds herself watching it longer than she intends. The way it moves. The particular arch of its neck. There is a grace to it that seems almost unnatural, as if something divine has settled into its flesh and refuses to leave. She shakes her head, turning away. It is only a bull. Beautiful, yes. Sacred, certainly, but still just an animal. The thought does not comfort her as much as it should. Minos spends the morning receiving ambassadors from Mycenae. They bring gifts and complaints in equal measure, speaking of trade routes and piracy and the complex politics of the mainland. He listens with the practiced attention of a king who has learned to appear engaged while his mind wanders elsewhere. Last night he slept poorly. His dreams were full of water rushing through dark corridors, though his palace stands on high ground and the plumbing has always been excellent. When the ambassadors finally depart, he finds himself walking toward the western terrace, the one that overlooks the sea. He tells himself it is simply for air, for a moment of peace between obligations. But part of him, a part he does not examine too closely, wants to look at the water, to see if it appears different than it did yesterday. The sea stretches calm and blue to the horizon. Gulls wheel and cry above the rocks. Waves break against the shore in their eternal rhythm. Everything seems perfectly ordinary. He releases a breath he had not realized he was holding. Perhaps he worried for nothing. Perhaps the gods did not notice, or having noticed, did not care. They have larger concerns than one bull on one island, surely. A servant approaches with wine and figs. Minos takes the cup, but does not drink. The wine's surface trembles slightly, though his hand is steady. He watches the small ripples spread and fade and wonders why his heart has begun to beat faster. In her private garden, Pacifier sits among the roses her gardeners cultivate with such devotion. She has brought scrolls to read, accounts from the palace steward that require her attention. But the letters blur before her eyes. She finds herself thinking instead about the white bull. About the way it stood in the pasture this morning, utterly still, as if listening to something only it could hear. The thought is ridiculous. Bulls do not listen to anything but their own hunger and simple instincts, and yet she cannot shake the image. Cannot stop herself from wondering what it will be like to stand that close to something so powerful, to touch that white coat and feel the heat of divine favor still radiating from its skin. She sets down the scrolls, frustrated with herself. This is not like her. She is the daughter of Helios, sun god and all-seer. She was raised among wonders. She has walked through palace halls where gods sometimes visited, has heard divine voices speaking in tongues of light. One blessed bull should not occupy so much of her thinking. And yet it does. The afternoon brings unexpected heat, unusual for this season. The palace grows drowsy with it. Servants move more slowly through their tasks. Even the frescoed dolphins on the walls seem to swim through thicker air, their blue-silver bodies wavering in the light that falls through high windows. Pacifier dismisses her maids and lies down in her chambers, seeking relief from the weight that has followed her all day. But sleep, when it comes, brings no rest. She dreams of the white bull again. In the dream it speaks to her, though its mouth does not move. The voice comes from everywhere at once, gentle as waves on sand, telling her things she cannot quite understand. When she reaches to touch it, her hand passes through its body as if it were made of moonlight rather than flesh. She wakes gasping, her linen shift damp with sweat. The sun has moved far across the sky. Hours have passed. But the dream has not faded the way dreams usually do. It remains vivid, present, as if she is still half within it even now. She rises and goes to the window. Without deciding to, she looks toward the pasture. The white bull has moved to the shade of an olive tree. It stands perfectly still, head slightly lowered, and for a moment it seems to her that it is looking back. That across the distance, and the heat shimmer, and the space that separates human from animal, their eyes meet. Her breath catches. Her heart stumbles over its rhythm, and then the bull turns away, and she is left wondering if she imagined the whole thing. If the heat has made her foolish, if she is falling ill with some fever that begins with strange thoughts and ends with delirium. She tells herself this must be the explanation. There can be no other. But even as she turns from the window, some part of her knows she is lying. Evening falls gently across Crete. The heat breaks at last. A breeze rises from the sea carrying salt and the smell of fish drying on racks along the shore. The palace prepares for the evening meal. Torches are lit in the great hall. Musicians tune their instruments. Life continues in its familiar patterns. At the high table, Minos and Pasiphae sit side by side as they have for years. They speak of small things. Palace business, their children's progress in their studies. Plans for the upcoming festival. To anyone watching, they appear exactly as a king and queen should. United, contented, secure in their position. But beneath the table, Pasiphae's hands are clenched so tightly her knuckles have gone white. And across the hall, Minos sees his reflection in a polished bronze mirror and barely recognizes the face that looks back at him. Something is coming. They both feel it now. A change moving toward them like a ship on a dark horizon, its sails too distant yet to make out clearly. Neither speaks of it. To speak would be to make it real. And so they sit in silence that pretends to be peace, while above them on Olympus, gods measure out portions of fate like wine into cups. The white bull sleeps in its pasture beneath stars that have witnessed everything and judged nothing. Tomorrow it will wake to another day of grass and water and the simple rhythms of animal life. But already it is becoming something more than it was. Already it is being transformed from beast to symbol, from God's gift to God's instrument. The labyrinth that will one day hold its offspring has not yet been imagined. But in the space where future touches present, in the invisible architecture of consequence, its first corridor has already been laid. Stone by stone. Choice by broken choice. The maze is growing in the dark. By morning, the strange weight in Pasiphae's chest has grown heavier. She wakes before dawn, throat dry, sheets tangled around her legs as if she has been struggling against some invisible restraint. The dream followed her through the night, changing shape but never quite releasing her. In it, the bull spoke again in that voice like distant waves, and this time she understood the words, though the moment she opened her eyes they slipped away like water through her fingers. She does not call for her maids. Instead, she wraps a plain cloak around her shoulders and moves through the sleeping palace like a shadow among shadows. Her bare feet make no sound on the cool stone floors. Dawn is just beginning to touch the eastern sky with pale fingers when she reaches the small door that leads to the outer courtyards. The air outside carries the morning smell of dew and earth. Somewhere a rooster calls, thin and questioning in the half-light. Pasiphae walks without conscious decision toward the pasture where the white bull sleeps. She tells herself she is merely restless, that she needs air and movement to clear her head of these foolish dreams, that there is nothing strange in a queen walking her own grounds before the sun rises. But her heart knows she is lying. The white bull stands when she approaches, as if it has been waiting. In the grey dawn light, Its coat seems to glow with its own luminescence, not quite natural, not quite divine, but something caught between. It watches her with dark eyes that hold depths she cannot fathom. There is no aggression in its stance, no fear, only a kind of patient attention that makes her breath catch in her throat. She stops at the fence. The wood is rough beneath her palms, real and solid and ordinary. The bull takes 3 slow steps toward her. 4, 5, until it stands close enough that she can see the individual lashes around its eyes. Close enough to smell the warm animal scent of it mixed with something else, something that reminds her of the sea after storms when the air crackles with Poseidon's passing. Her hand rises without her willing it, extends toward that white coat that gleams like marble, like moonlight, like the foam on breaking waves. For a moment she hovers there, trembling on the edge of touching something she knows she should not touch. Every rational part of her mind screams warnings. This is madness. This is fever. This is divine punishment for her husband's pride, manifesting as unnatural desire. But the warnings are distant things, easily ignored. Her fingers brush the bull's neck. The coat is impossibly soft, softer than any animal's hide should be, and warm. So warm. Heat radiates from it like sun-baked stone, like embers banked for morning, like the blood of something more than mortal pulsing just beneath the surface. The bull does not move, does not pull away. It stands perfectly still beneath her touch, and she feels something shift inside her chest. A lock turning. A door opening onto darkness she never knew was there. She pulls her hand back as if burned. Steps away from the fence. Her heart hammers so hard she can hear it in her ears, a desperate rhythm that drowns out thought. What is happening to her? She is daughter of the sun. She is queen of Crete. She is rational and educated and chosen by gods for her wisdom. And yet she wants to climb the fence. She wants to press herself against that white hide and feel the divine heat of it seep into her bones. She wants things she cannot name and would not speak aloud even if she could. She turns and runs. Not gracefully, not like a queen, but like a woman fleeing from something terrible that pursues her. The palace swallows her back into its dim corridors, and she does not stop running until she reaches her chambers. There she collapses onto her bed, gasping, shaking, horrified by the strength of what just moved through her. It is a curse. She knows this now with cold certainty. No natural desire feels like this, consuming and irrational and utterly beyond her control. Poseidon has done this to punish Minos, and she is merely the instrument of his vengeance. The sea god's anger flows through her veins like poison, turning her own heart against her reason. She presses her face into her pillows and weeps silently, not because she is ashamed, though shame is certainly there, bitter and choking, but because she knows with terrible clarity that this is only the beginning, that whatever has been set in motion will not stop until it has run its full course, until the price for broken promises has been paid in full. Above her on Olympus, Aphrodite smiles. The goddess of love has added her own touch to Poseidon's vengeance, because what the sea god begins with anger, she perfects with cruel artistry. The curse she has woven into Pasiphae's heart is not mere animal attraction. It is obsession refined to its purest form. It is desire that will not be reasoned with or prayed away. It is love in its most monstrous shape. The goddess leans back on her couch and plucks a pomegranate from a golden bowl. She bites into it slowly, savoring the sweet tart juice. Mortals are such fragile things, so easy to break, so entertaining to watch as they shatter. Days pass like fever dreams. Pasiphae tries to resist. She locks herself in her chambers and refuses to go near the pastures. She throws herself into her duties with desperate focus, reviewing grain stores, settling disputes among palace servants, overseeing her children's lessons. Anything to keep her mind occupied. anything to drown out the pull that grows stronger with each passing hour. But resistance is futile. At night, the dreams grow more vivid, more explicit. She wakes with her hands clutching empty air and tears streaming down her face. During the day, she finds herself staring into nothing, thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. She cannot eat, cannot focus. Cannot be the woman she was only a week ago. Her maids notice. They whisper among themselves when they think she cannot hear. The queen is ill. The queen is troubled. The queen stares out windows toward the southern pastures with an expression that frightens them. Minos notices too, though he does not yet understand what he is seeing. He asks if she is well. She smiles and says she is merely tired. He accepts this because it is easier than pressing further. Because he has his own troubles to occupy his thoughts. The white bull has become a symbol of his kingship, displayed proudly to visiting dignitaries, proof of divine favor. He has no attention left to spare for his wife's inexplicable melancholy. On the 7th night, Pacifier gives up. She cannot fight this any longer. The curse has grown too strong, the obsession too all-consuming. If she does not act, she will go truly mad. She will waste away to nothing while desire burns through her like wildfire through dry grass. She needs help. She needs someone brilliant enough, clever enough, amoral enough to help her do the impossible. She needs Daedalus. The workshop of Daedalus occupies a corner of the palace compound that most courtiers prefer to avoid. Too much sawdust, they complain. Too much noise. The smell of hot metal and wood shavings and strange oils whose purposes no one wishes to inquire about too closely. But these complaints are merely excuses for a deeper discomfort. The truth is that genius makes people uneasy, especially when it wears the face of an exile. Pacifier stands outside his door as dawn light creeps across the compound. She has not slept. Her feet are bare again, her hair unbound beneath a simple cloak. No crown. No jewelry. She cannot bring servants to this conversation. Some desperation must be faced alone. She knocks. 3 soft taps that seem loud as thunder in the pre-dawn silence. Movement inside. Shuffling. A muttered curse in the Athenian dialect. Then the door opens and Daedalus stands there, blinking sleep from his eyes. He is older than she expected. 50 perhaps, with grey threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved beside his mouth. His hands are stained with pitch and ink. His tunic hangs rumpled, as though he fell asleep in his clothes. He recognizes her instantly. His eyes widen, and he steps back, already bowing. "My queen." "I did not. It is very early. I need to speak with you." Her voice sounds strange, even to her own ears. Flat. Hollow. The voice of someone who has already drowned and is speaking from beneath dark water. He glances past her, checking if she brought guards or attendants. Seeing none, his expression shifts from surprise to wariness. Nothing good comes from queens visiting craftsmen's workshops alone before sunrise. He has lived long enough to know that much. "Of course. Please, come in." He steps aside, and she enters his domain. The workshop is chaos made tangible. Every surface holds something, half-built mechanisms of bronze and wood. Sketches scattered across tables, tools hanging from walls in careful arrangement that speaks of a mind that must organize its external world because its internal landscape is too vast to contain. In one corner stands a wooden bird, wings spread as if frozen mid-flight. In another, a child's toy, a spinning top carved with such precision it catches the lamplight like a small sun. Daedalus lights another lamp, then another. Buying time while he tries to understand what has brought the Queen of Crete to his door at this impossible hour, he offers her a stool, the only clean seat available. She sits. He remains standing, waiting. "You are Athenian," she begins. "I was." Once. His voice carries the weight of old sorrows he will not explain. She has heard rumors, something about a nephew, a death, an accusation. Athens had cast him out, and Minos, always eager to collect talented men the way other kings collect gold, had welcomed him to Crete. "Then you understand exile," she says. "You understand what it means to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control." He nods slowly. "I understand many kinds of traps, my queen." She takes a breath. This is the moment. Once she speaks the words aloud, there will be no taking them back. But silence has become more impossible than speech. I need you to build something for me. Something that has never been built before. Something impossible. Interest flickers in his tired eyes. Daedalus is a man who has spent his entire life solving impossible problems. It is what he does, what he is. "Tell me." So she does. The words spill out like water through broken dam. She tells him about the white bull, about the obsession that consumes her, about dreams that leave her shaking and waking hours that have become unbearable. She does not mention curses or gods. She does not need to. Daedalus has been in Crete long enough to recognize divine meddling when he sees its effects. When she reaches the request itself, her voice drops to barely a whisper. "I need you to build me a cow, hollow. Large enough for me to... Large enough. It must be so perfectly crafted that the bull will believe it is real." Silence fills the workshop. Outside, roosters begin their morning chorus. Somewhere in the palace, servants are waking. The world continues its normal rhythms while here, in lamplight and sawdust, a queen asks a craftsman to facilitate the unthinkable. Daedalus does not look shocked. He looks sad. Infinitely, profoundly sad. "My queen, if I build this thing, there will be consequences. The gods do not set such curses in motion without purpose." "I know." Her hands twist in her lap. "I know what I am asking. I know what it means. But I cannot. I cannot live like this. Not one more day. Not one more hour." He studies her face. Sees the desperation there, and beneath it, the intelligence. Pacifier is not stupid. She knows exactly what she is proposing, and understands the full horror of it. But understanding does not make the curse any less powerful. Knowledge is no shield against divine will. "If I refuse?" he asks quietly. "Then I will find another way. And it will be messier, more dangerous, more likely to fail and leave me destroyed in the attempt." She meets his eyes. "You are the only one skilled enough to do this properly, to do it safely." Safely. The word hangs in the air like bitter incense. There is nothing safe about what she proposes, but he understands what she means. A well-built mechanism versus desperate improvisation, engineering versus catastrophe. Daedalus walks to his work table and runs one hand across the scarred wood. How many impossible things has he built in this room? How many devices that bent the rules of nature and pushed against the boundaries of what should be? He is a man who creates because he must, because his mind cannot rest, because problems demand solutions and he cannot turn away from a challenge. But this is different. This is not a mechanical bird or a clever lock. This is participation in something that will echo through generations. That will birth consequences he cannot calculate or control. "I will need time," he says finally. "A week, perhaps 2. And absolute secrecy. No one can know what I am building or who commissioned it." Relief floods her face. It frightens him, that relief. It confirms what he already suspected. She is far past the point of turning back. With or without his help, she will find a way to satisfy this terrible hunger that divine anger has planted in her heart. "You have my word," she whispers. "And my gratitude. Anything you need. Materials, gold, protection. It is yours." He nods. Already his mind is working through the problems. Structure, weight distribution, texture. Hide treated to feel real beneath an animal's investigation. A hollow large enough to conceal a human form, but shaped to deceive divine sight. Joints that move naturally. It will require every bit of skill he possesses. It will be his masterwork and his shame in equal measure. "There is one more thing," he says. "When this is done, whatever comes from it, that burden will not be mine to carry. I am the craftsman, nothing more." "Understood." She rises from the stool. Dawn is fully here now. Soon the palace will wake completely. She must return to her chambers before her absence is noted. "I will send payment tonight." "Begin whenever you are ready." She moves toward the door, then pauses. "Daedalus, why did you agree?" "Truly?" He does not answer immediately. When he does, his voice carries the weariness of a man who has made too many compromises with his own conscience and knows he will make many more before his story ends. "Because I understand what it means to be powerless against forces larger than yourself. Because I know what exile feels like, and yours is worse than mine ever was. And because," he gestures vaguely at the workshop around them, "because I solve problems. It is all I know how to do." She nods once, grateful for his honesty if nothing else. Then she slips out into the morning light, pulling her cloak close around her shoulders. Daedalus stands alone in his workshop as the sun rises over Crete. Around him, his creations watch with silent wooden eyes. The bird that will never fly, the top that spins endlessly. And soon gods help him, a hollow cow that will deceive a divine bull. He is the greatest craftsman of his age. He can build anything his mind conceives. But there are some things that should never be built. Some problems that should never be solved. And as he reaches for his sketching tools and begins the first rough drawings, he knows with absolute certainty that he will regret this choice for the rest of his life. But regret has never stopped him before, and it will not stop him now. The commission takes 13 days to complete. Daedalus works alone, turning away even his most trusted apprentices with invented excuses about personal projects that require solitude. He locks his workshop door and works by lamplight, sometimes through entire nights when sleep will not come, and his hands demand occupation. The palace passes through its rhythms around him, festival days and council meetings, and the ordinary business of rule, while beneath it all, in sawdust and shadow, something impossible takes shape. The frame comes first. He selects wood carefully, testing each piece for weight and flexibility. Cedar for the skeleton, light enough to be moved but strong enough to support the structure. He carves the bones of the thing with a precision that borders on obsessive, measuring 3 times before each cut, checking angles with instruments he built for the construction of ships and siege engines. The legs must bear weight naturally. The neck must curve as a living creature's curves. Every joint requires consideration. He works with his door barred and heavy cloth hung over the windows. Even the morning light feels too exposing. What he is building must remain hidden until the moment of its use, and even then, even when it serves its purpose, the truth of it must stay secret. Some acts of craftsmanship are best left unrecorded in any official history. The hide proves more difficult than the frame. Pacifier sends him cured cowhide treated to softness, delivered in unmarked bundles at midnight by servants who ask no questions and meet no eyes. Daedalus stretches the leather across his work table, studying the grain and texture. It must look right, feel right, smell right. The white bull is no ordinary beast. Divine awareness runs through it like current through water. Any falseness will be detected immediately. He stitches the hide with thread made from animal sinew, each stitch small and tight, creating seams that will be invisible from even a hand's breadth away. His fingers cramp from the repetitive motion, his eyes burn from working by insufficient light. But the work demands perfection, and Daedalus has never been a man who could accept anything less than what his vision requires. On the seventh day, he creates the head. This is the most crucial element, the part that must withstand the closest scrutiny. He carves it from a single piece of olive wood, shaping the broad forehead and gentle muzzle with chisels, fine enough to etch names on grain. The eyes he makes from polished amber, set deep beneath carved brows. In certain light, they almost seem to hold consciousness. It disturbs him how real they appear. The horns come last for the head, actual bull horns purchased from a butcher through an intermediary who asked no questions beyond the price. Daedalus mounts them at precisely the correct angle, testing and adjusting until they sit as horns should sit on a living skull. When he steps back to examine his work, the head watches him with amber patience, and he has to turn it face down on the table to continue working. By the 9th day, assembly begins. He connects the sections with hidden joints that allow natural movement. The mechanisms inside must permit a human form to fit within while keeping the exterior proportions accurate. This requires engineering of the most delicate sort. Too much internal space and the structure becomes obviously hollow. Too little, and it becomes a torture device rather than a concealment. He tests the interior space himself, climbing awkwardly inside the half-finished form to check clearances and breathing holes. The darkness inside is absolute. The smell of leather and wood shaving surrounds him. For a moment, pressed against the inner walls of his own creation, Daedalus feels the full weight of what he is building. This is not clever mechanism or harmless invention. This is architecture of transgression, a tool for breaking natural law. He climbs out quickly, breathing hard, and does not test the interior again. The final details consume the last 4 days. Texture painting to match the mottled pattern of cowhide, strategic placement of real cow hair adhered with glue made from boiled fish bones. Creating the subtle imperfections that make something appear natural rather than crafted. A small scar on the left flank. Slight asymmetry in the ears, the kind of details only a master would notice, and only a master would think to include. On the 12th night, Pacifier comes to inspect the work. She arrives after midnight, wrapped in the same plain cloak, accompanied only by silence and desperate hope. Daedalus has positioned the finished piece in the center of his workshop, illuminated by a circle of oil lamps that make the hide seem to glow from within. She walks around it slowly, one hand trailing across the smooth leather. Her expression is unreadable. Wonder, perhaps, or horror at seeing the physical manifestation of her cursed desire, or simply relief that the waiting is almost over. "It is perfect," she says finally. Her voice is very quiet. "I would not know it was false if I had not watched you build it." "The white bull may be more perceptive than we hope," Daedalus warns. "Divine creatures see differently than mortals." "It may sense the deception. Then I will die attempting this." She says it simply, without drama, a fact stated clearly. "But I must attempt it. You understand this." He does. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that tells him to burn this thing and forget it was ever conceived, he understands. The curse leaves her no choice. Free will becomes meaningless when gods rewrite desire itself. "I will have it delivered to the location you specified," he says, "tomorrow night. You must go alone, no witnesses. The servants who help you position it must be sent away before, she nods. Already her mind is elsewhere, calculating logistics and timing, planning the impossible act that will either satisfy the curse or destroy her in the trying. She is a queen and has ruled alongside her husband for years. She knows how to plan complicated endeavors. Before she leaves, she places a heavy purse on his work table. Gold enough to purchase a ship, or silence, or perhaps just to prove that even cursed queens pay their debts. "I will not see you again," she says at the door. "Whatever comes from this night, our paths should not cross afterward, for both our sakes." Agreed. He does not watch her go. Instead, he stares at his creation, this hollow thing that wears the shape of life but holds only emptiness within. In the lamplight, shadows pool in the curves of its form, and for just a moment he could swear he sees it breathe. The next evening, 3 trusted servants arrive with a covered cart. They load the wooden cow carefully, wrapping it in canvas to protect it during transport. They ask no questions. They have been paid not to remember this night or anything that occurred during it. Daedalus watches the cart roll away into darkness and feels the first stirrings of the regret he predicted 13 days ago. He spends that night cleaning his workshop, burning sketches and plans, scattering the distinctive sawdust, erasing evidence of construction as thoroughly as he can. By dawn, the space looks much as it did before Pacifier's first visit, tools on their hooks. Abandoned projects gathering dust, no sign that anything world-changing was built here. But the smell of worked leather lingers in the air, and when he closes his eyes, he can still see amber eyes watching him from a carved olive face. Some creations haunt their makers. Some problems, once solved, poison everything they touch. 9 months from now, the true cost of his craftsmanship will become apparent. But tonight, Daedalus does not think about the future. He sits in his empty workshop and stares at his hands, these clever hands that can build anything, solve any problem, create any impossible thing. These hands that perhaps should have learned long ago when to refuse. Minos receives the news at dawn. A messenger, pale-faced and choosing words with the delicacy of someone handling sharp glass, delivers the report in the king's private chambers. The queen is with child. The physicians are certain. The timeline matches precisely with that strange spring month when Pacifier withdrew from court life, claiming illness, appearing only at formal dinners with distant eyes and trembling hands. The king dismisses the messenger with a gesture, sits alone in the growing light. Outside his window, Crete wakes to another perfect morning. Fishing boats put out to sea. Market vendors arrange their wares. Children chase each other through narrow streets. The island continues its peaceful rhythms, unaware that beneath the surface of ordinary days, something extraordinary and terrible is taking shape. Minos knows the child cannot be his. The mathematics of absence and presence make that impossible. He has been away on diplomatic journeys, leading campaigns on neighboring islands. Even when present in the palace, he and Pasiphae have maintained separate chambers for months. The distance between them has grown like frost, slowly, silently, until warmth seems a memory from some other marriage. But whose child, then? What mortal would dare approach the Queen of Crete? What guard or servant or visiting dignitary could have breached the careful walls of palace protocol? He considers having every man in the palace questioned, tortured if necessary, finding the guilty party and making an example that would echo through generations. Except he suspects, in the sick certainty that settles in his stomach like cold stone, that no mortal is responsible. There are forces at work here that exceed human understanding, divine patterns weaving themselves into mortal lives. The white bull still grazes in the royal pastures, magnificent and untouchable, a living reminder of Minos's broken promise to Poseidon. The god of oceans does not forget debts unpaid, and punishment from Olympus rarely arrives with clear explanation or merciful swiftness. He summons his wife to his chambers that afternoon. She enters with her head high, meeting his gaze with something that might be defiance or might simply be exhaustion beyond caring. She is already beginning to show. The robes she wears are cunningly draped to minimize the evidence, But a husband's eye, even an estranged husband's eye, can read the truth in posture and the way fabric falls. They stand facing each other across a space that feels wider than the room can hold. Outside, garden fountains splash with cheerful ignorance. Songbirds trace patterns through warm air. The world continues its business while a king and queen negotiate the boundaries of unspeakable things. "Tell me," he says finally, "just that." No accusation, no rage. Simply the request for truth, however strange it might be. She tells him. Not everything. The deepest shame she keeps locked in silence. But enough. The compulsion that seized her. The unnatural desire that felt like madness burning through her mind. The curse she suspects was placed upon her by divine hands, punishment for a husband's broken oath, washing over a wife who made no promises herself. "I could not resist," she says quietly. "Believe that or do not. But know that I fought against this thing until fighting became impossible." Minos listens. His face reveals nothing. Years of kingship have taught him to hold expression like a shield. Inside, though, emotions war in complicated tangles. Anger at betrayal. Horror at the nature of that betrayal. Guilt that his own pride set these events in motion. And underneath all of it, the cold political calculation that has kept Crete prosperous and his throne secure. The child cannot be allowed to live openly. That much is certain. Whatever emerges from this pregnancy, it will be evidence of divine displeasure. Proof that the king's bloodline has been corrupted or cursed. The neighboring kingdoms who watch Crete with envious eyes would pounce on such weakness. Rebellions have been built on less dramatic foundations. But killing it outright? That path leads to different complications. This is still Pasiphae's child. Still, technically, something that shares blood with royal lineage. The gods who curse them might take further offense if the product of their manipulation is simply destroyed. Divine punishment often comes in layers, each response spawning new consequences, until simple men are crushed beneath the weight of immortal displeasure. When it is born, Minos says, each word placed carefully, it will be kept in secret. No public acknowledgement. No place in succession. It will live, but it will not be seen. Pasiphae nods. Her relief is visible. She expected death for the child, perhaps death for herself. This compromise, cold as it is, offers survival. A narrow path through impossible terrain. "I will need a place prepared," the king continues. "Somewhere secure, hidden, where something can be kept indefinitely without possibility of escape or discovery. A prison, you mean?" She says it plainly, a necessary arrangement. He turns to the window, unable to look at her any longer. "Send for Daedalus. If any man can build such a place, it is him." The summons reaches the craftsman that evening. He arrives at the palace with wariness already settling around him like a cloak. This is his second call to solve impossible problems. The first led him to places he wishes he had never walked. Now, standing in the king's presence, he suspects the second will lead him deeper still. Minos does not waste time on pleasantries. He explains what is needed. A structure beneath the palace. Extensive. Complex beyond easy navigation. A maze from which no inhabitant could find egress no matter how long they searched. Something that could hold a prisoner for years, decades, a lifetime if necessary, with no hope of freedom. "You speak of a labyrinth," Daedalus says slowly. The word tastes strange on his tongue, older than Greek, borrowed from languages that predate Olympian gods. It means, roughly, the house of the double axe, a place of ritual and confinement. Sacred architecture with darker purposes. "Can it be built?" Minos asks. Daedalus considers the challenge. His mind, unable to resist the lure of difficult problems, is already sketching possibilities. corridors that double back on themselves, false passages leading to dead ends, intersections designed to confuse direction and distance, chambers that look identical, destroying any attempt at mental mapping. The whole thing built on multiple levels, with stairs that might lead up or down or circle back to starting points. It would require years to construct. Teams of workers, all sworn to secrecy. Careful planning to ensure the final structure maintains its disorienting properties. Stone by stone, the architecture of permanent imprisonment taking form beneath Knossos' foundations. It can be built, he says finally. But I will need time, complete authority over the construction, and when it is finished, when this labyrinth stands complete and ready. He pauses, meeting the king's eyes directly. What exactly will you put inside it? Minos does not answer. The silence stretches between them, heavy with implications that neither man wants to speak aloud. Outside the window, stars are beginning to appear. Night settling over Crete like a held breath. Begin the work, the king says instead. I will send the architect's maps of the palace substructure tomorrow. Build what is needed. Ask no further questions. Daedalus bows and withdraws. Walking through the palace corridors, past guards who do not meet his eyes, he feels the weight of new knowledge pressing down. He has been asked to build a cage, not for a common criminal, not for a political prisoner, for something else. Something connected to the Queen's hidden pregnancy and the strange curse that hangs over the royal house. 9 months. That is how long he has. 9 months to design and begin construction of the most complicated structure he has ever attempted. 9 months before the nature of the prisoner becomes clear. In his workshop that night, by lamplight that makes shadows dance across stone walls, Daedalus begins to sketch. Corridors branch and twist across parchment. Intersections multiply. Dead ends bloom like dart flowers. The labyrinth takes shape first in his mind, then on paper, and soon, very soon, in the patient stone beneath an island that once seemed blessed by gods, but now appears cursed by them instead. He works through the night, and somewhere in the palace above, Pacifier lies awake in her chambers, one hand resting on her growing belly, feeling movement that is neither quite human nor quite animal, but something caught between, something that will need Daedalus's maze to call home when the time comes. The white bull grazes in moonlit pastures, divine and perfect, knowing nothing of consequences. The dawn comes too quickly for those who have spent the night planning prisons. Daedalus stands among the palace foundations as first light touches Knossos, holding maps that show what lies beneath. The substructure is older than most realize. Previous palaces stood here, built and destroyed by earthquakes that shook Crete like a dog shaking water from its coat. The foundations go deep, with chambers and passages already carved into living rock. He traces possible routes with one finger. The existing tunnels could form the labyrinth's bones. New construction would add complexity, turning straightforward storage rooms into something far stranger. The project appeals to him despite its grim purpose. Perhaps because of it. There is honesty in building a prison, less pretense than constructing temples where gods might never actually dwell. Workers arrive as the sun climbs higher. Minos has assembled them carefully. Men from different villages who do not know each other well, less chance of coordinated gossip that way. Less risk of stories spreading across the island like morning mist. Each man is sworn to silence about what he builds. The penalty for loose tongues is not specified, but understood. They begin with the lower chambers. Torches are lit and carried into darkness that has remained undisturbed for generations. The air smells of earth and time, and something older than memory. Stone dust rises as picks bite into walls, opening new passages that branch from ancient ones. Daedalus works without rest, driven by something he cannot name. The labyrinth grows in his mind, even as it grows in stone. He sees it complete before a single corridor is finished. Every turn measured, every intersection calculated. The whole thing designed according to principles that feel less like architecture and more like ritual. He orders certain walls built at specific angles. Not right angles, but close enough to deceive the eye while subtly disorienting anyone who walks past them repeatedly. The floors slope imperceptibly in some corridors, making direction difficult to judge. Ceiling heights vary by inches, creating psychological unease without obvious cause. Weeks pass into months. The work continues in lamplight and shadow. Above ground, Crete maintains its usual rhythms. Markets flourish. Ships arrive and depart. Children play in palace gardens where fountains splash and songbirds quarrel over nesting sites. Life proceeds normally for those who do not know what grows beneath their feet. But Pacifier knows. Her pregnancy advances with the labyrinth's construction. There is symmetry in it, 2 prisons taking shape simultaneously. One of stone beneath the earth, one of flesh that will soon deliver its occupant. She visits the construction site once, heavily cloaked despite summer heat. Daedalus sees her standing at the entrance to the descending passages, looking down into darkness that swallows torchlight after only a few yards. She says nothing. He says nothing. What words could possibly serve? She turns and leaves, and Daedalus returns to his calculations. The labyrinth needs a center, a heart, a final chamber where all the twisting passages ultimately lead, though anyone walking them would never realize they were approaching it. He designs this space with particular care. It will be round, domed, with a single opening high above where moonlight might fall on certain nights. Not enough light to truly illuminate, just enough to remind whatever lives there that a sky exists somewhere beyond reach. A calculated cruelty that Daedalus justifies as mercy. Better to remember the world than to forget it entirely. The chamber is carved from solid bedrock, smooth walls that offer no purchase for climbing. Floor worn smooth by ancient water that once flowed here when the earth was younger. The workers finish it in late summer, and Daedalus stands alone in the completed space, listening to his own breathing echo. This will be someone's entire world. These stones, this darkness, these echoing sounds. Nothing else, no horizon. No weather, no seasons except what can be inferred from temperature changes filtering down through countless tons of rock. It is the most terrible thing he has ever built. He climbs back to the surface and orders the final phase to begin. The outermost passages, the ones nearest the entrance, designed to be most confusing of all. These will feature identical intersections that repeat at irregular intervals. Corridors that seem to go somewhere but circle back, false doors carved into stone that open onto walls. The mathematics of it pleases him, each choice point offering multiple paths, most leading nowhere useful. The probability of finding the correct route through trial and error alone approaches 0. Someone could wander for years, touching every wall, and never discover the exit. As autumn arrives, the basic structure stands complete. Miles of passageways wind through darkness beneath Knossos. The entrance is disguised as an ordinary storage access, easily overlooked among the palace's many utilitarian chambers. Only Daedalus knows the route from entrance to center. He has walked it hundreds of times during construction, counting steps, memorizing turns. He could draw a map, but he does not. Maps can be stolen. Memory alone is safe. He becomes a living key to the labyrinth, the only person who understands what he has created. Minos inspects the work on a cool morning when wind carries salt spray from distant waves. He descends with guards carrying torches, following Daedalus through twisting passages that quickly destroy any sense of direction. The king says little, but his silence carries approval. This will serve. This will hold. They reach the central chamber. Minos stands in the space his gold will occupy, looking up at the distant opening where sky barely shows. His expression remains unreadable. But something passes behind his eyes. Regret, perhaps. Or resignation. The acknowledgement that some problems cannot be solved, only contained. Well built, he says finally. 2 words that dismiss months of labor. 2 words that seal a creature's fate before it draws first breath. They return to the surface. Daedalus emerges into afternoon light that seems impossibly bright after the labyrinth's darkness. He blinks, adjusting, and sees palace servants moving about their duties. Normal life continuing as it always has. Only now, beneath their feet, a maze waits empty. Not for long, though. Pasiphae's time approaches. The midwives have been summoned. Secret chambers prepared in the palace's oldest wing, where thick walls muffle sound. Everything stands ready for a birth that cannot be celebrated, cannot be announced, cannot even be properly acknowledged. Daedalus returns to his workshop that evening. The labyrinth is finished, but he feels no satisfaction, only a creeping dread that this creation will outlast him. That centuries hence, when his name is forgotten, the maze will still exist, still twist in darkness, still trap whatever walks its corridors. He pours wine but does not drink it. Outside, the island settles into darkness. Fishermen secure their boats. Farmers close shutters against night breezes. Children are called inside. All the ordinary rituals of ending day. Beneath it all, the labyrinth breathes. Waits, patient as stone can be. Soon it will receive what it was made to hold. Soon the empty corridors will know footsteps. The central chamber will house something that belongs nowhere else in the world. Daedalus finally drinks the wine. It tastes of nothing. Across the wine-dark sea in Athens, a different grief takes root. The city wakes each morning to temples crowned with marble and markets loud with trade, but beneath the prosperity runs a thread of sorrow that will not break. It began years ago, before the labyrinth was even conceived, with a young man's death and a father's rage. King Aegeus of Athens had one son, Androgeos, a youth whose skill at games and contests brought honor to his father's name. Strong of limb, quick of mind, beloved by those who knew him. When the Panathenaic Games were announced, Androgeos traveled to compete, carrying his father's blessing and the hopes of Athens on his shoulders. He won every contest. Wrestling, running, throwing. His victories accumulated like summer light, bright and undeniable. The crowds cheered. Poets composed verses in his honor. For a few golden days, he seemed touched by divine favor itself. Then he died. Not in honorable combat, not facing some beast or challenge worthy of song. He was murdered, ambushed on a lonely road by men whose jealousy had curdled into violence. They left his body in dust, his victories meaningless, his promise extinguished before it could fully bloom. Word reached Athens like winter arriving early. Aegeus received the news in his great hall, surrounded by advisers and petitioners. They say he did not weep immediately. He simply sat very still, the parchment trembling in his hands, while silence spread through the chamber like spilled wine. Only later, alone in his private chambers, did the king permit himself to grieve. His cries echoed through the palace that night. Servants pretended not to hear. The city learned to avert its eyes from their king's sorrow, but Minos of Crete would not avert his eyes, would not let the matter rest, for Androgeos had been a guest in Crete when he traveled to the games, had enjoyed Cretan hospitality. His death, therefore, became Crete's concern, an insult to Minoan honor that demanded answer. The fleet arrived on a morning that dawned too bright for what it carried. Cretan ships darkened the horizon, their sails like storm clouds against blue sky. They came not for trade or diplomacy, but for vengeance dressed in the language of justice. Minos himself stood at the lead ship's prow, his face carved from the same stone as his palace. Athens was strong, but Crete commanded the sea. The city's walls were high, but Crete's fleet could starve them with blockade. Aegeus understood the mathematics of war. Sometimes survival requires surrender. They met in neutral ground, the two kings. Aegeus, older now, grief having aged him beyond his years. Minos, terrible in his righteousness, a father avenging a son he had not even sired. They spoke briefly. The terms were not negotiated. They were pronounced. For the death of Androgeus, Athens would pay tribute, but not in gold or grain, not in ships or trade concessions. The price would be measured in lives. Every 9 years, 7 Athenian youths and 7 Athenian maidens would be sent to Crete. There they would enter the labyrinth beneath Knossos. What happened to them after that, Minos did not specify. He did not need to. Everyone understood that those who entered the maze would not return. Aegeus tried to refuse, stood taller despite his sorrow, and declared, Athens would never pay such a price. Better to fight, to fall defending their children, than to feed them to Cretan darkness. His council nodded agreement. The city prepared for war. But war brings its own casualties. Crops burned, villages razed. The Cretan fleet was merciless, methodical. They did not need to conquer Athens. They only needed to make resistance more costly than compliance. 3 months of fighting broke the city's resolve. Aegeus watched smoke rise from farms that had fed Athens for generations, heard reports of fishing boats seized, trade routes cut, allies turning away. The war could continue. Athens might even eventually prevail. But the cost would hollow out everything they fought to preserve. He accepted the terms on a grey morning when rain fell soft as ash. The first tribute would be selected by lot, 14 names drawn from Athens's youth. 14 families who would lose children to settle a debt they had not incurred. The lottery took place in the agora, while citizens wept openly and mothers clutched their sons and daughters close. The chosen ones were given 7 days to prepare, to say farewells, to put their affairs in order, though most were too young to have affairs that mattered. They were dressed in white, like sacrificial victims, and led to the black-sailed ship that would carry them to Crete. Athens lined the harbor to watch them depart. No one cheered. No one waved. They simply stood in terrible silence while the ship raised anchor and turned its prow toward distant shores. Aegeus stood on the palace heights, watching until the black sail disappeared beyond the horizon. The ship did not return. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, new sails appeared bringing merchants and travelers, but never the vessel that had carried 14 children into shadow. Athens learned to live with absence, with empty chairs at family tables, with questions that would never find answers. 9 years can seem like both an eternity and no time at all. Athens rebuilt, prospered again. The grief became familiar, a companion rather than a wound, until the year turned and the calendar marked the approach of the second tribute. Again, the lots were drawn. Again, 14 white-clad youths walked to the harbor. Again, the black-sailed ship departed while a city held its breath. This too passed. 9 more years. The rhythm of suffering established itself. Every generation of Athenian children grew up knowing that some among them would be chosen, that Crete's hunger would be fed with their bodies, their futures, their unrealized dreams. By the time the third tribute approached, it had become almost routine. The lots were drawn without surprise. Families wept, but quietly, as if loud grief might attract additional misfortune. The chosen 14 accepted their fate with resignation learned from watching others accept theirs. But this time, something different stirred. In the palace, Aegeus' son Theseus, who had grown to manhood watching these tributes depart, stood before his father with a proposal that would change everything. The young prince, strong and proud, declared he would volunteer. would join the tribute not as a lottery victim, but as a chosen warrior, would enter the labyrinth and kill whatever waited in its heart. Aegeus refused, forbade it absolutely. He had already lost one son to Cretan machinations. He would not lose another. They argued through the night, father and son, love and duty pulling them in different directions. Outside the palace windows, Athens slept unaware that its future was being decided by a conversation only shadows witnessed. But Theseus had inherited his father's stubbornness. When morning came and the lots were drawn, the prince's name was announced among the chosen. Aegeus protested loudly that his son had not entered the lottery, but Theseus stepped forward calmly and took his place among the 14. The old king wept then. Not the private grief he had hoarded through the years, but open sorrow witnessed by all Athens. He embraced his son before the assembled crowd and made him promise only one thing. The ship bore black sails to mark its sorrowful cargo. If Theseus survived, if he returned victorious, he must change those sails to white. So his father, watching from the cliffs, would know from afar that his son lived. Theseus promised. They clasped hands. Then the 14 walked to the harbor, where the black-sailed ship waited to carry them toward Crete, toward the palace of Knossos, toward the entrance of the labyrinth that had swallowed so many and returned none. Above them, clouds gathered soft as fleece. The sea breathed gently against the shore. Everything seemed ordinary, peaceful, as if the world had not just tilted toward tragedy or triumph, toward endings that would echo through centuries in stories told by firelight to listeners who would never truly understand what it meant to walk toward certain darkness carrying only hope and a promise. The ship sat low in the water, dark wood weathered by salt and sun, its single mast rising like a question mark against the morning sky. The black sail hung loose, waiting for wind that had not yet arrived. On the deck, sailors moved with practiced quiet, loading provisions and testing ropes, their faces carefully empty of opinion or pity. Theseus stood among the other 13, feeling the weight of eyes on his back. The chosen ones clustered together on the dock, some crying softly, others staring at nothing with the blank expression of those who have already begun to leave the world behind. A girl near him, perhaps 16, clutched a small carved bird her father had made when she was a child. Her fingers had rubbed the wood smooth over the years until it gleamed like amber. An old woman approached the group carrying a basket of bread and dried fruit, offerings for the journey that felt more like funeral gifts. She moved among them, pressing food into their hands, murmuring blessings that meant nothing and everything. Her own grandson had been chosen in the first tribute 27 years ago. She had been young then. Now her hair was white as the sails they would never see unfurled. The captain, a Cretan sailor with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had witnessed too many of these crossings, gestured for them to board. One by one they climbed the gangplank, that narrow bridge between the life they knew and the one that awaited. The wood creaked beneath their feet. Everything creaked. The ship itself seemed reluctant. Theseus was the last to board. He turned once more to look at the harbor, at Athens spreading up from the water in tiers of white stone and terracotta, at the palace on its hill where his father would be standing at a window watching. He raised his hand in farewell, though he could not see if the gesture was returned. The wind arrived then, as if it had been waiting for this moment. It filled the black sail with a sound like a long exhale. The ship began to move, pulling away from the dock with the slow inevitability of all departures. The distance between ship and shore grew wider, the faces of the crowd becoming less distinct, until Athens itself was just a pale smudge against the mountains. The 14 stood at the rail, watching their city shrink. No one spoke. What words existed for this? Eventually, one by one, they drifted away to find places to sit or lie down in whatever small comfort the deck could offer. Theseus remained standing, his hands gripping the worn wood of the rail, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea spread around them in all directions, wine dark and restless. Waves rose and fell in rhythms older than memory, each one carrying the ship farther from everything known. The sailors worked their ropes and adjusted the sail, speaking only when necessary, their voices lost quickly in the wind and water. By noon, Athens had vanished completely. There was only sea and sky, the line between them blurring in the haze of distance. Theseus finally moved from the rail and found a place near the mast where coiled rope made an uncomfortable seat. Around him, the others had arranged themselves in small groups. Some talked quietly. Others slept or pretended to sleep. The girl with the carved bird sat near him, her fingers still working over the smooth wood. She caught him looking and offered a small, sad smile. "It's a sparrow," she said softly. "My father said it would keep me company when he couldn't. What's your name?" Theseus asked. "Melantha," she answered. "My mother wanted me to stay hidden when the lots were drawn, said we could leave the city, go somewhere, Crete would never find us. But that would mean someone else's daughter would go in my place." She looked down at the bird. "I couldn't do that." A boy across from them, broad-shouldered and trying hard to look brave, spoke up. "My name is Hylas. My father fought at Marathon. He taught me never to run from duty." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the fear he worked so hard to hide. Others began to introduce themselves. Phaedra, whose mother was a weaver. Cadmus, who had hoped to become a sculptor. Ismene, who loved mathematics and had been studying the stars. Each name carried a life behind it, dreams that would likely die in darkness beneath Knossos. The crossing would take 3 days if the winds favored them. The Cretan captain dispensed water sparingly from clay amphorae lashed near the stern. The bread the old woman had given them grew hard quickly in the salt air. At night they huddled together for warmth while stars wheeled overhead in patterns. Ismene named quietly, her voice barely audible above the constant rush of water against the hull. Theseus watched those stars and thought about the labyrinth, about what waited in its center. The stories Athens told were vague and terrible. Some said the creature was huge, capable of tearing a man in half with its bare hands. Others claimed it was cunning, able to speak, to lure victims deeper into the maze with promises of escape. A few whispered that it was suffering, trapped and alone, more to be pitied than feared. But pity would not save them. Only strength would. Only a sword and the will to use it. Theseus had brought neither openly. The Cretans would search them upon arrival. But he had his hands, his determination, and the training his father had insisted upon since childhood. It would have to be enough. On the second day, dolphins appeared alongside the ship, leaping and diving in patterns that seemed almost like dance. The 14 watched them with something approaching joy. For those few moments they could forget where the ship was taking them and simply marvel at the grace of creatures who knew nothing of labyrinths or tributes or the weight of old grief. Melantha held her wooden bird up as if showing it to the dolphins. "Look," she whispered. "Remember what it's like to fly." By the third day, Crete appeared on the horizon. At first, just a dark line between sea and sky, it grew steadily larger, resolving into mountains and cliffs, and eventually the white walls of Knossos itself, sprawling along the shore like a creature sunning itself on the rocks. The harbor was busy with ships from across the known world, Egyptian merchants unloading papyrus and incense, Venetian traders haggling over purple dye, fishing boats bringing in their morning catch, while gulls screamed and wheeled overhead. The black-sailed ship from Athens moved among them like a ghost, attracting glances that quickly looked away. They docked at a private pier away from the main harbor. Cretan guards waited there, armed with spears and the casual authority of men who knew they would not be challenged. The 14 were led off the ship in single file, still wearing their white garments now stained with salt and travel. Theseus stepped onto Cretan soil and felt the earth steady beneath his feet after 3 days of constant motion. The guards surrounded them, not roughly but firmly, making clear that resistance would be pointless. One of them, older than the others with a scar crossing his left cheek, looked at Theseus with something that might have been sympathy. "This way," he said simply, and began walking toward the palace. They passed through streets paved with stone, between buildings painted in bright colors that seemed to mock the gray fate awaiting them. Citizens paused to watch them pass, some with curiosity, others with the studied indifference of people who had seen this before and preferred not to think about what it meant. The palace of Knossos rose before them, vast and intricate, its walls adorned with frescoes of bulls and dancers and flowers. Everything spoke of wealth, of power, of a civilization that feared nothing because it had conquered everything that once threatened it, including Athens. They were led to a courtyard where fountains played and fig trees offered shade. There they would wait, the scarred guard explained, until King Minos decided when the labyrinth would receive them. It might be today. It might be tomorrow. Time moved differently in Crete, especially for those whose time was running out. The wait in the courtyard stretched through the afternoon like a shadow growing longer. Time felt different here, suspended between the vivid life of the palace above and the darkness they all knew waited somewhere below their feet. The fountains continued their constant music, water falling into stone basins carved with dolphins and octopi. Fig trees rustled in a breeze that carried the scent of the sea mixed with something sweeter, jasmine perhaps, or honeysuckle from gardens they could not see. The 14 sat where the guards had left them, their white garments bright against the painted stones. No one had told them they could not move, but no one had said they could either, so they remained still, listening to the palace breathe around them. Footsteps echoed from corridors they could not see. Voices murmured in rooms beyond walls. Somewhere a woman laughed, the sound carrying clear and careless across the courtyard before fading into silence. Melantha still held her wooden bird. A thumb had worn a groove in its wing from constant rubbing. Theseus watched her and wondered what his own hands were doing, whether they betrayed the same nervousness. He tried to keep them still, resting on his knees, but they wanted to move, to grasp something, to prepare for action that had no clear shape yet. A servant appeared, carrying a tray of clay cups filled with water and a basket of figs. She was young, perhaps 16, with dark hair bound in an elaborate style. Theseus had never seen in Athens. She set the tray down without speaking and retreated quickly, but not before her eyes met his for just a moment. In that glance he saw something he could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or warning. They drank the water gratefully. It was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, different from Athenian wells. Phaedra took a fig and ate it slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last meal. Others followed her example, though some could not bring themselves to eat. Ismene stared at the fountain instead, watching the patterns the water made when it fell, her mind clearly working through some calculation only she understood. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows shifted on the courtyard stones. No one came to speak to them. No guards returned to move them elsewhere. They simply waited, and the waiting became its own kind of torment, worse in some ways than knowing would have been. It was Hylas who broke the silence. "Do you think they're watching us?" His voice sounded loud after so much quiet. "Probably," Cadmus replied. He had been studying the windows that looked down into the courtyard, counting them perhaps. A palace this size, there must be servants everywhere. And anyone important enough would want to see what Athens sent this time. "We're not cattle," Phaedra said softly, but without real conviction. They all knew what they were. Tribute. Payment for old violence. Bodies to feed into the maze beneath their feet. Theseus stood then, unable to sit any longer. He walked to the fountain and looked into its basin. The water was clear enough that he could see his own reflection wavering on its surface. His father's face looked back at him, or would someday if he lived long enough. The thought of Aegeus standing on Athens's walls watching for black sails or white made something tighten in his chest. Theseus. Melantha's voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone's coming." He turned. A figure had appeared at the courtyard's far entrance, standing in the shadow of the archway. Not a guard this time. A woman in robes of deep blue, embroidered with silver thread that caught the late afternoon light. She stood very still, watching them with an intensity that made Theseus straighten unconsciously. Then she stepped forward into the sunlight, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. Young, perhaps his own age, dark hair falling in curls past her shoulders. Eyes that held something sharp and sad at once, like bronze that had been left too long in the rain. She carried herself with authority, with the kind of posture that came from growing up in palaces where every movement was observed and judged. This, Theseus knew without being told, was royalty. A daughter of Minos. Princess Ariadne, if the stories he had heard were true. She walked toward them slowly, taking her time, studying each face. The 14 remained seated except for Theseus, who stood beside the fountain watching her approach. When she reached them, she stopped a few paces away, maintaining the distance that separated kings' daughters from tribute meant for monsters. "You are the Athenians," she said. Not a question. Her voice was lower than he had expected, with an accent that made familiar words sound strange and beautiful. 7 men and 7 women, sent to honor the old agreement. "We are," Theseus replied, since no one else seemed able to speak. Her gaze settled on him then, and he felt the weight of it like something physical. She was looking at him not as tribute, not as meat for the labyrinth, but as a person. As if trying to understand something she saw there that surprised her. "You volunteered," she said. Again, not a question. I heard the guards talking. A prince of Athens who chose to come when he could have sent others in his place. My father's people should not bear alone what their king's son can share. The words came out more formal than he had intended, stiff with the consciousness of speaking to someone whose father held his life in careless hands. Something flickered across her face. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of honor in a place where she had not expected to find it. She looked away from him then, toward the others, and her expression softened slightly. "You will be given quarters for tonight," she said, "rooms in the palace's lower levels. Food will be brought, water for washing. My father will see you tomorrow when the sun reaches its height. Until then, you are guests." Guests. The words sat strangely in the air between them, contradicting everything they knew about why they were here. Ariadne turned as if to leave, then paused. When she looked back, it was at Theseus again, and something in her eyes had changed. A decision made, perhaps, or a question forming that would not leave her alone. "What is your name?" he asked. "Theseus." "Son of Aegeus." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. "Theseus," she repeated, tasting the name. Then, quieter, almost to herself, "The labyrinth has never returned anyone." "I know," he said. "Yet you came anyway." "I did." For a long moment she simply looked at him. Around them the fountains continued their ancient song. Fig trees rustled. The palace breathed in and out with the lives moving through its countless rooms, and in that moment something passed between the Athenian prince and the Cretan princess that neither could have named. A recognition, a thread beginning to unspool that would lead deeper than either of them imagined. "I will see you again before tomorrow," Ariadne said finally, "when the palace sleeps and the moon is high. In the garden beyond the eastern wall, where the olive trees grow oldest. If you would speak of things that cannot be said in daylight." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and walked back toward the archway, her blue robes trailing behind her like water across stone. At the entrance, she paused and glanced back one final time. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and the echo of impossible possibility. Hylas broke the silence first. "What was that about?" "I don't know," Theseus replied, still staring at the empty archway. but his heart knew something his mind could not yet shape into words. Hope, dangerous and fragile as a flame in wind, had been offered in a Cretan courtyard by a king's daughter with sad bronze eyes. And tonight, when the moon rose high, he would walk to an olive garden and discover what thread she meant to give him. The sun dipped lower toward the western sea, painting the palace walls in shades of amber and rose. Servants appeared without announcement, moving through the courtyard with practiced efficiency that spoke of lives spent anticipating needs before they were voiced. They carried bundles of clean linen, clay lamps filled with olive oil, and baskets of bread still warm from ovens hidden somewhere deep in the palace's stone heart. A young man with a servant's collar around his neck gestured for the Athenians to follow. He led them through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that made Theseus wonder if the labyrinth's influence had seeped upward into the palace itself. The walls here were painted with scenes of dolphins leaping through waves, painted so vividly they seemed to move in the lamplight. Octopi curled their tentacles around painted rocks. Fish swam in eternal schools across plaster seas. Their quarters were in the lower levels, as Ariadne had promised. A row of small rooms opening onto a shared courtyard where a single olive tree grew from a square of earth. The rooms were simple, but not unkind. Sleeping couches covered in woven blankets, washing basins of bronze. Windows too narrow for a body to pass through, but wide enough to admit air and the distant sound of waves. The servant left them without speaking, and the 14 stood uncertainly in the gathering dusk. They were alone for the first time since leaving Athens, without guards watching their every movement, and the sudden privacy felt almost threatening. Cadmus claimed a room at the far end. Melantha chose one near the olive tree. The others dispersed quietly, moving like people too exhausted by fear to make decisions that mattered. Theseus took the room nearest the courtyard's entrance, where he could watch the corridor beyond and count the passing of hours by the changing angle of moonlight on stone. Food came as darkness settled fully. The same silent servants, bringing platters of fish cooked with herbs he didn't recognize, bread drizzled with honey, olives cured in brine, and wine mixed with water in the Cretan manner. They ate without much appetite, picking at the meal more from habit than hunger. When the servants returned to collect the platters, they brought with them clay lamps for each room. Small flames that would burn through the night, pushing back the darkness but never quite defeating it. The light they gave was gentle and insufficient, leaving corners shadowed and creating strange movements in peripheral vision that might have been nothing or might have been everything. The palace quieted as evening deepened. Footsteps passed less frequently in the corridors beyond their courtyard. Voices faded into distance. Somewhere far above, musicians played instruments whose sounds carried thinly through stone, a celebration they were not invited to join. Theseus lay on his sleeping couch, watching the lamp's flame dance and listening to the soft breathing of his companions in nearby rooms. Some had fallen into exhausted sleep. Others shifted restlessly, unable to find peace in beds provided by those who would send them to die tomorrow. He waited until the music stopped completely, until the footsteps ceased altogether, until the palace seemed to hold its breath in the deep quiet that comes only in the hours after midnight when even the wakeful begin to doubt their wakefulness. Then he rose, moving silently as his father had taught him during hunting trips in Attic forests. He left his sandals behind. Bare feet made no sound on cool stone. He moved through the courtyard, past the olive tree whose leaves whispered secrets to themselves, and into the corridor beyond. The palace at night was a different creature than the palace at day. Shadows gathered in archways like living things. Lamps burned in wall niches, but their light seemed reluctant, as if afraid to venture too far from its source. The painted dolphins on the walls looked menacing now, their leaps through painted waves suggesting desperation rather than joy. Theseus moved by instinct more than knowledge, following a sense that might have been divine guidance or might have been simple luck. He passed through chambers filled with storage jars taller than a man, through corridors where frescoes showed bulls dancing with human figures in configurations that defied natural movement, through doorways hung with curtains that stirred in draughts he could not feel. The eastern wall revealed itself gradually. He found it by following the scent of night-blooming flowers whose perfume grew stronger with each turning. The garden appeared as if by magic, opening suddenly from a narrow passage into an expanse of moonlit green. The olive trees grew there, as Ariadne had said. Ancient and gnarled, their trunks thick as temple columns, their branches spreading wide to create pools of shadow beneath silver leaves. The moon hung high and full, painting everything in shades of grey and white and deepest blue. She was already there, standing beneath the largest tree with moonlight caught in the silver embroidery of her robes. She had changed from the deep blue of afternoon to something lighter, almost white, that made her seem like a spirit rather than flesh. Her dark hair was unbound now, falling loose down her back in waves that caught the moon's glow. "I wasn't certain you would come," Ariadne said as he approached. Her voice was quieter here, more intimate than it had been in the courtyard, as if the garden demanded softer speech. "How could I not?" Theseus stopped a few paces away, maintaining the same careful distance she had established earlier. "A king's daughter offers to speak of things that cannot be said in daylight. Only a fool would refuse. Or a coward." She studied him with those bronze, sad eyes. "But I don't think you are that. I am many things, princess. Brave is not necessarily among them." A slight smile touched her lips, surprising him. "Men who are truly brave never claim to be. I have noticed this." She gestured toward a stone bench beneath the olive tree's spreading branches. "Sit. We have until dawn, and what I need to say requires time." They sat, not touching, the space between them filled with moonlight and the scent of flowers Theseus could not name. Night birds called in the distance. The olive leaves whispered continuously, a sound like waves or breath or secrets being kept. "The labyrinth," Ariadne began, then paused. When she continued, her voice carried the weight of long-held sorrow. "You should understand what it is before you enter. Not just a maze of stone, though it is certainly that. My father commissioned it. Daedalus built it. But it has become something more than either of them intended." "A prison for your mother's shame," Theseus said gently. She flinched slightly, but did not look away. "You know the story, then?" "Athens knows many stories about Crete, about King Minos, about the white bull and the price of broken promises to gods. Stories." She spoke the word as if it tasted bitter. "Yes, there are always stories. But stories don't tell you what it sounds like when your half-brother cries in the darkness and no one answers. Stories don't explain what happens to a creature raised in shadow, fed on fear, growing larger and more lost with every passing year." Theseus said nothing. The grief in her voice needed no response. "I was young when they took him below," Ariadne continued. "I remember seeing him only once, when he was still small, still more child than monster. He reached for me, you know, through the bars before they sealed him away forever. His hands were strange, yes, but the gesture was entirely human, entirely innocent." She paused, and in the silence Theseus heard what she was not saying. That she had lived her whole life in a palace built above an immense cruelty. That every step she took on Knossos's painted floors was a step above her brother's prison. "The tributes," she said finally. "They are sent to the center where he waits. Most die of terror before they ever see him. The labyrinth feeds on fear, you understand. It shifts its passages based on the panic of those who walk it. The more afraid you are, the more lost you become. And those who don't die of terror? Then the Minotaur finds them." Her voice was barely a whisper now. "And he is as lost as they are, as afraid, as desperate for connection in the crushing loneliness of that place. But he is large and strong, and has forgotten how to be gentle. And so—" She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Theseus looked up at the moon through olive branches. Somewhere in Athens, his father was perhaps looking at the same moon, wondering if his son still lived. Somewhere far below this garden, passages wound through darkness toward a center where something sad and terrible waited in eternal solitude. "You are going to help me," he said. "Not a question. I am going to try." Ariadne reached into her robes and drew out a ball of thread. It gleamed in the moonlight, golden and impossibly fine. "Daedalus gave this to me years ago. He said that if ever someone entered the labyrinth who deserved to leave it, this thread would show the way. You tie one end at the entrance and unwind it as you walk. When you need to return, you follow it back." "Imple, why me?" Theseus asked. "Why now, after all the others?" She looked at him then, and in her eyes he saw something that made his breath catch, something beyond pity or politics or even attraction, a kind of recognition that went deeper than words. "Because when I saw you this afternoon," she said quietly, "you looked at my home not with greed or hatred, but with sadness. Because you chose to come when you didn't have to. Because I am tired of living above that suffering and doing nothing." She held out the thread. "And because tomorrow at noon my father will send you to die, and I find I cannot bear for that to happen." Theseus took the thread from her hands. Their fingers touched briefly, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that suggested she was as frightened as he was. The golden thread was lighter than air, strong beyond reason. "Thank you," he said, knowing the words were insufficient, but having no others. "Don't thank me yet." Ariadne stood, moonlight making her seem tall and strange and beautiful. "The thread will lead you back, but first you must reach the center. First you must face what waits there, and Theseus, when you do—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "Remember that monsters are made, not born. Remember that even in darkness, frightened things deserve mercy." Before he could respond, she leaned down and kissed his forehead gently, a gesture somewhere between blessing and farewell. Then she turned and walked away through the moonlit garden, leaving him alone beneath ancient olive trees with a ball of golden thread and the certainty that tomorrow would change everything. The moon continued its arc across the sky. The palace breathed in sleep around him. And Theseus sat holding the thread that might save his life, thinking about what it meant that a princess would betray her father for the sake of a stranger, and what price such betrayal might demand when morning came. The dawn came too quickly, as dawns always do when sleep has been scarce, and the mind too full of impossible things. Theseus had returned to the lower quarters while stars still burned overhead, the golden thread hidden beneath his tunic where it lay coiled against his heart like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Around him, the other tributes slept restlessly, their breathing shallow and uneven. One girl whimpered in her dreams. A young man stared at the ceiling with eyes that had stopped seeing anything but the darkness ahead. When pale light finally filtered through the narrow windows, painting the courtyard's olive tree in shades of copper and gray, no one spoke. They rose mechanically, washed their faces in bronze basins that reflected haunted creatures, and dressed in the simple clothes that had been provided. Someone had laid out clean white garments for them, ceremonial in their plainness, clothes for sacrifice. The palace began to wake around them. Servants moved through corridors bearing water jugs and bread baskets. Guards changed positions at doorways with the soft clink of bronze and leather. Somewhere deeper in the complex, Theseus heard voices raised in morning prayers, words offered to gods who listened or didn't, who cared or remained indifferent to the small tragedies of mortals caught in divine games. They were brought breakfast, though few could eat. Bread and honey, dried figs, goat cheese. The food turned to ash in Theseus's mouth, though he forced himself to swallow. He would need strength for what lay ahead. Across the courtyard, he caught the eye of a boy no more than 16, thin and frightened, who had barely spoken since leaving Athens. Their gazes held for a moment, and Theseus tried to offer something like hope through the silence. The boy looked away first. Mid-morning came, and with it the guards. They were not rough, but neither were they gentle. The 14 tributes were led from their quarters through passages Theseus was beginning to recognize, past the great hall with its pillars like forest trunks, past chambers where merchants had gathered with their wares, where palace officials moved with scrolls and wax tablets, conducting the business of an empire built on commerce and conquest, and one terrible secret buried below. They descended. Not yet to the labyrinth itself, but to a wide chamber near the palace's foundation, where King Minos waited on a throne of carved cedar. Queen Pasiphae sat beside him, her face a mask of careful blankness. Ariadne stood to one side with her sisters, and Theseus saw how she held herself utterly still, as if movement might shatter whatever fragile control kept her standing there at all. Minos spoke. His voice echoed off stone walls older than memory, formal and heavy with ritual that had been performed 3 times before. He spoke of debt and justice, of his son Androgeos, whose blood stained Athenian soil, of the price that must be paid when kingdoms break their oaths. The words washed over Theseus like waves against rocks, eroding nothing, changing nothing, simply fulfilling some requirement that tradition demanded before the real horror could begin. When the speech ended, the guards moved forward again. The tributes were led deeper, down passages where lamplight grew scarcer, and the air took on the coolness of earth that never saw sun. They passed through chambers carved from living rock, through spaces where water dripped steadily into pools that reflected torchlight like fallen stars. The stone beneath their feet grew older with each step, laid by hands that had shaped these passages generations ago for a purpose no one had imagined would become a prison. At last they reached it. The entrance to the labyrinth stood before them, a doorway cut into stone that seemed to breathe darkness. The opening was perhaps twice the height of a man, wide enough for 3 to walk abreast, but it gave the impression of narrowness anyway, as if the space itself was contracting with reluctance. Beyond the threshold, corridors branched in 3 directions, each passage identical, each leading into shadow that lamplight could not penetrate more than a few paces. The tributes clustered together before the entrance, like birds before a storm, drawing courage from proximity, even as they understood it meant nothing. Fear moved through them visibly, a tremor that passed from person to person like wind through wheat. Someone was crying quietly. Someone else had begun to pray, words stumbling over themselves in desperate petition to Athena, to Apollo, to any god who might possibly intervene. Theseus felt the thread against his chest, warm from contact with his skin. He thought of Ariadne's kiss, gentle as moth wings against his forehead. He thought of his father watching from Athens' cliffs for sails that would not come for many days yet, if they came at all. He thought of the creature waiting somewhere in the darkness ahead, raised in solitude, fed on terror, growing more lost with each passing year in passages that shifted like dreams. The guards began pushing them forward, not violently but firmly, inevitably. One by one, the tributes crossed the threshold. Each step took them farther from lamplight, deeper into the cool, breathing darkness of the labyrinth. Theseus went last, and as he passed beneath the stone lintel, he paused and reached up, tying the loose end of Ariadne's golden thread to an iron ring set into the rock. His fingers worked quickly, knotting the impossibly fine strand with practiced movements learned on ships and in training grounds. The thread caught the last of the outside light and gleamed briefly before the darkness. A head swallowed its length. Then he stepped forward, and the labyrinth received him as it had received all the others, closing around them like water, like shadow, like the kind of trap that has no walls because it exists inside the mind itself. The passages smelled of damp stone and old earth, of time passing slowly in places where seasons meant nothing. Their footsteps echoed strangely, sounds bending around corners that seemed too close and too far simultaneously. Within moments, Theseus had lost all sense of direction. The corridor they followed curved gently, then branched again and again, each choice offering paths that looked identical in the dim light, filtering from somewhere undefined above. The tributes stayed together initially, moving as a group through passages that seemed to breathe around them. But fear works differently on different souls, and soon they began to separate. Some walked faster, desperate to reach the center and face whatever waited there, rather than endure this slow dissolution of certainty. Others hung back, hoping that delay might somehow transform into escape. The group fractured into smaller clusters, then into pairs, then into frightened individuals wandering alone through stone corridors that whispered with sounds that might have been wind or water or something else entirely. Theseus let the thread unspool behind him, feeling its weight diminish impossibly slowly. It seemed to extend forever, defying any natural understanding of how much thread could fit in the small ball he'd carried. Magic, he supposed, or simply Daedalus's craft, which in many ways amounted to the same thing. The thread ran through his fingers like liquid gold, marking his path through the shifting maze, leaving behind the only certainty in a place designed to erase all certainty from those who entered it. The darkness ahead swallowed sound before it could travel far. Theseus walked with one hand trailing along the damp stone wall, feeling the rough texture of rock carved by tools older than memory. The golden thread spooled out behind him, invisible now except when faint light from somewhere above caught it briefly, turning it momentary bright before shadow reclaimed it. Around him, the labyrinth breathed. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but with actual rhythm, as if the passages themselves were lungs expanding and contracting in some vast body buried beneath Crete. Cool air moved past his face, carrying scents of earth and mineral, and something else, something animal and sad that he could not name. The walls seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, corridors bending slightly, distances changing in ways that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus. He had lost sight of the other tributes minutes ago. Their footsteps had scattered in different directions, some running, some creeping, all of them swallowed by passages that led everywhere and nowhere. Occasionally he heard distant sounds, a cry cut short, the scrape of sandals on stone, once something that might have been laughter or weeping, or simply echo playing tricks in acoustics designed to confuse. The labyrinth did not need walls to trap. It trapped through repetition, through the way each turn looked like the last, through the slow erosion of confidence that came from walking endlessly without arriving. Theseus focused on the thread. It remained his only certainty, a line connecting present to past, depth to surface, wandering to return. He wound it carefully around his left hand as he walked, keeping tension light so the delicate strand wouldn't break. Ariadne's gift. Ariadne's faith. He wondered if she was above him now, standing somewhere in the palace gardens, looking at stars and thinking of him below in passages where stars had never shone. The corridor branched again. 3 passages, each identical, each descending slightly into deeper shadow. Theseus chose the center path without logic or reason, simply because standing still meant surrendering to the maze's primary weapon, which was doubt. He walked forward, and the labyrinth accepted his choice with perfect indifference, offering more corridors, more branches, more opportunities to become lost in stone that remembered everyone who had ever wandered here. Time became difficult to measure. Minutes felt like hours. Hours might have been minutes. His legs ached with walking, but the passages never ended, never opened into chambers or clearings, just continued winding through rock that pressed close on both sides. Sometimes the ceiling lowered until he had to duck. Sometimes it soared away into blackness overhead, where he sensed but could not see vast spaces carved from living stone. He passed alcoves cut into walls, empty now but showing signs of ancient use. Niches where lamps once burned, their soot still marking the stone. Carved symbols worn smooth by centuries of damp air, their meanings lost to erosion and forgetting. In one alcove, he found a clay cup lying on its side, the glaze cracked but intact, abandoned by some long-dead artisan who had worked in these depths before they became a prison. He left it undisturbed, a small memorial to ordinary lives that had moved through this space when it served different purposes. The breathing grew louder. Not his own breathing, though his breath came heavy from constant walking, but the other breathing, the one that came from somewhere ahead or below, or simply from the labyrinth itself. Deep, slow inhalations followed by exhalations that moved the stale air in rhythmic pulses. Animal breathing, he thought at first, but then recognized something human in it too, the catch of emotion, the pause of thought, the sound of loneliness made audible through respiration. Another branch. This time 4 passages instead of 3, spreading like fingers from a stone palm. Theseus paused, his hand on the wall where moisture had collected in a thin film that made the rock feel alive. Which way led to the center? Which path took him toward the creature that waited in darkness, fed annually on fear and young flesh, kept alive by a curse that should never have touched innocent blood? He chose the leftmost passage because the breathing seemed fractionally louder in that direction. The corridor descended more steeply now, the floor sloping downward in gradual decline that suggested he was moving toward the labyrinth's deepest levels. The air grew cooler, heavy with underground dampness, carrying sounds that might have been water trickling through distant chambers or might have been whispers in languages no living tongue remembered. The golden thread continued unspooling, impossibly long, impossibly fine, gleaming occasionally in the strange, sourceless light that filtered through the labyrinth's upper reaches. Theseus imagined it stretching behind him through all the turns and branches he'd taken, a single unbroken line connecting him to the world above. He wondered if Ariadne could somehow feel his progress through the thread, if some magic in its making let her know he still walked, still searched, still carried her hope along with his own. A sound ahead stopped him. Not breathing this time, but movement, the scrape of something heavy shifting on stone. Hooves, perhaps. Or feet that had forgotten how to be entirely human. Theseus reached for the sword at his belt, the bronze blade that Athens's finest smith had forged for him before departure. The metal felt cold against his palm, solid and real in a place where reality had become uncertain. He rounded a corner and found himself in a slightly wider passage, the walls here carved with deliberate patterns, spirals and waves that repeated endlessly, designed to confuse the eye and trick the mind into seeing movement where only stone remained still. The patterns made him dizzy when he looked directly at them, so he kept his gaze on the floor, following the slight groove worn into the rock by centuries of footsteps, water, and perhaps other things that had moved through these depths over long years. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber. Not the center, not yet, but a space larger than the corridors, roughly circular, perhaps 30 paces across. The ceiling rose higher here, lost in darkness above. And against the far wall, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight that somehow penetrated from the surface far overhead, sat a figure that might once have been a child. Theseus stopped breathing. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge his presence, simply remained hunched against the stone with its massive shoulders curved forward and its head bowed as if in prayer or exhaustion. Too large for human, too still for animal. The moonlight caught edges and curves, the slope of a powerful neck, the suggestion of something growing from the skull that might have been hair or horn or both. For a long moment, neither moved. The labyrinth breathed around them, patient as time, indifferent to whatever would unfold in this chamber where moonlight fell like grace on something the world had decided to forget. The thread in Theseus's hand remained taut, connecting him to escape, to promise, to the life that waited if he could only turn and follow it back to the light. But he didn't turn. He stood instead in the moonlit chamber, watching the figure against the wall, understanding with sudden clarity that the real monster wasn't what waited here in darkness, but what dwelt in palaces above, in the hearts of kings who chose pride over wisdom, in the calculations of those who found it easier to feed tragedy than end it. The figure shifted slightly, and in that movement Theseus saw weariness that transcended species, loneliness that made his own isolation seem like luxury. The Minotaur had not turned to look at him yet, had not acknowledged the visitor who brought sword and thread and all the weight of Athenian hope. It simply sat in moonlight, breathing slowly, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of those who have nothing left to lose. The sound of Theseus's breathing must have been enough. The figure stirred, turned slowly, and for the first time in perhaps years, the Minotaur looked at a living person who had come not as tribute trembling in forced procession, but as something else. A hunter. An enemy. A visitor whose eyes held something besides fear. In the moonlight, the creature's face was not quite animal and not quite human, but caught eternally between both in a way that made it impossible to look at without pain. The skull was broad, the jaw powerful enough to crush bone, but the eyes were gentle, confused, carrying the bewildered sorrow of something that had never asked to exist. Curved horns grew from the temples, smooth and dark, beautiful in their symmetry. The body beneath was massive, muscled like a bull bred for strength, but the hands that rested on the stone floor were almost human, fingers that might once have learned to hold things gently before the world taught them violence. They regarded each other across the chamber. Theseus kept his hand on his sword hilt, but did not draw. The Minotaur remained seated, shoulders rising and falling with each breath, watching the young man who had entered its maze carrying bronze and thread and the angry grief of a city that demanded this ending. Somewhere far above, Athens slept. King Aegeus would be standing at the palace windows perhaps, unable to rest while his son walked through darkness beneath foreign stone. The tributes who had survived the journey would be huddled near the labyrinth's entrance, praying to gods who seemed very far away tonight. And Ariadne, brave and foolish and kind, would be holding the distant end of the golden thread, feeling it pulse with her racing heart. But here, in this chamber where moonlight fell like judgment or mercy or both, time moved differently. Theseus found himself lowering his hand from the sword, taking a single step forward. The Minotaur's eyes followed the movement, but it made no move to attack, to bellow, to charge with the fury that stories attributed to it. It simply watched, waiting to see what this young man would choose. "They say you kill them," Theseus said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the enclosed space, too soft for the words it carried. "The tributes who are sent down here, they say you hunt them through the passages and tear them apart in the darkness." The Minotaur made a sound that might have been agreement or denial, or simply acknowledgement that sound had been directed toward it. Words, if it had ever possessed them, seemed beyond reach now. Years in the maze had perhaps taken speech along with everything else that made loneliness bearable. Theseus looked around the chamber, seeing for the first time the details that moonlight revealed. Bones in the corners, yes, human and small, scattered like accusations, but also scratches on the walls, marks that might have been attempts at counting days or years before numbers lost meaning. A torn piece of cloth that had once been fine fabric, perhaps kept as comfort or memory of a mother's dress. And near the wall where the Minotaur sat, a small collection of stones arranged in careful patterns. The kind of arrangements that children make when playing becomes the only way to pass time that stretches endlessly forward. "You were a child once," Theseus said, "and it wasn't a question, someone's son. Someone gave birth to you and loved you before they locked you down here and tried to forget." The Minotaur's eyes closed slowly, a gesture so human that Theseus felt something crack in his chest. When they opened again, moonlight caught moisture that might have been tears or might have been the dampness that covered everything in the labyrinth's depths. The creature shifted its weight, hooves scraping softly against stone, and in the movement was the ghost of a small boy who had once walked on two legs through palace corridors before pride and curses made him into this. Theseus thought of his own father, of Aegeus's weathered hands grasping his shoulders before departure, of the promise extracted with tears that the sails would be changed if he survived. He thought of Ariadne's whispered instructions in the garden, her fingers trembling as she pressed the thread into his palm. He thought of the 14 who had come with him, some barely older than children themselves, sacrificed to appease a king's wounded vanity and the gods' casual cruelty. And he thought of the white bull that Poseidon had sent. Beautiful and divine. The gift that Minos should have offered back, but chose to keep. And how that single choice had cascaded through the years into this moment. This chamber, this creature that sat waiting for death because living had become too heavy to carry anymore. "I'm supposed to kill you," Theseus said softly. The sword remained at his belt, untouched. "Athens sent me here for this, to end you and end the tribute and sail home carrying proof that the monster is dead." The Minotaur nodded slowly, understanding perhaps not the words but the intention behind them. It did not move to defend itself, did not prepare for battle. It simply sat in the moonlight looking at the young man who held its fate in his hands, and in its eyes was something that looked almost like relief. How long had it waited for this ending? How many years in darkness hoping that someone would finally come and finish what the curse had started? Theseus crossed the chamber slowly, his sandals soft on stone, until he stood close enough to touch the creature that should have been his enemy. The Minotaur watched him approach with the stillness of something that has run out of fear, that has worn through terror to the exhausted acceptance on the other side. Up close, the beast was even larger than he'd imagined, powerful enough to tear him apart with ease if it chose. But it didn't move. It breathed quietly, smelling of animal musk and stone dampness, and something else, something sweet and sad that Theseus couldn't name. Perhaps sorrow had its own scent after enough years of accumulation. He reached out slowly and placed his hand on the Minotaur's massive shoulder. The creature flinched at first, perhaps unused to gentle touch after so long alone, then stilled. Through the thick hide and muscle, Theseus could feel the heartbeat, strong and steady, the proof that this was no mindless monster, but something alive and aware and suffering in ways that violence could never end. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for what they did to you. For what I have to do now." Because there was no other path forward, no way to leave the maze without proof, no future that didn't end here with bronze and blood, and one more tragedy added to the pile that kings made when they chose pride over wisdom. The Minotaur closed its eyes again. In the darkness of the labyrinth, where moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, Theseus drew his sword at last. The blade sang softly as it left the sheath. Bronze forged in Athens carried through wine-dark seas to this moment. His hand remained steady even as his heart broke. This wasn't victory. It was simply one more name added to the long list of those who suffered for others' choices. What happened next in that moonlit chamber, no song fully captures. The poets say Theseus fought a mighty beast and won through courage and skill. But courage takes many forms, and skill can mean knowing when to be quick and merciful rather than long and cruel. When it was done, when the Minotaur's breathing finally stilled and the curse that had held him trapped between human and beast released him at last, Theseus knelt beside the body in silence. The golden thread waited patiently in his other hand, the path home still open, still possible. But home suddenly seemed very far away, and the victory Athens would celebrate tasted of nothing but ashes and necessary sin. He stood slowly, legs trembling, and turned back toward the passage from which he'd entered. The thread gleamed in the darkness, impossibly bright, Ariadne's hope made visible. He followed it without looking back, leaving the center of the maze behind, leaving the Minotaur to whatever rest the dead might find in darkness. The labyrinth's passages seemed to shift as he walked, perhaps disappointed to lose its purpose, perhaps relieved that the long story was finally ending. The corridors whispered around him as he climbed, following the golden thread through turns that seemed both familiar and strange. Time moved differently in the labyrinth. Hours might have passed, or merely moments. The thread wound through his fingers like a lifeline, each gentle tug drawing him closer to the surface, to air that didn't taste of stone and shadow, to a world where sunlight still existed. Behind him, deeper than echo could carry, the center of the maze stood empty at last. Theseus emerged into moonlight that felt impossibly bright after the labyrinth's depths. The entrance chamber where his companions waited erupted into whispered relief when they saw him. 13 young faces turned toward their unexpected salvation. They had huddled together in the darkness, certain they would die here, certain that Athens would forget them, as it had forgotten so many tributes before. Now they stared at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. "It's done," Theseus said quietly. The sword at his belt was clean again. He had stopped at an underground spring to wash away what needed washing, though some stains settled deeper than bronze could reach. "We need to go. Now, before the dawn brings guards and questions we cannot answer." They moved through the palace grounds like ghosts, 14 Athenians and 1 Cretan princess who had chosen hope over loyalty. Ariadne met them at the garden gate as promised, her face pale in the starlight, her hands clutching a small bundle of belongings hastily gathered. She looked at Theseus and saw something in his eyes that made her reach for his hand without speaking. The ship waited at the harbor, black sails furled, oars ready. They slicked aboard in silence and pushed away from Crete's shores as quietly as water allowed. Behind them, Knossos slept on, unaware that the tribute it had swallowed would not be digested this time, unaware that beneath the palace something had shifted in the darkness that could never be shifted back. Theseus stood at the stern as Crete diminished into shadows on the horizon. Ariadne found him there eventually, the thread she had given him still wound around his fingers like a golden scar. "Did you have to?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," he said, and then, after a long moment, and no. The world demanded it. Fate demanded it, but the creature itself had stopped demanding anything at all. He paused, watching the wake their ship carve through dark water. "I think it was grateful at the end. I think it had been waiting for someone to come and finish what it could not finish alone." She said nothing for a while, simply stood beside him in the salt breeze. "My father will rage when he discovers what's happened," she said finally. "He'll send ships, perhaps. He'll call it theft and betrayal." "Perhaps," Theseus agreed. "But perhaps he'll also be relieved." The tribute was always about vengeance, about making Athens suffer for his son's death. But vengeance is exhausting work, and even kings grow tired of maintaining it. The ship sailed through darkness toward dawn, carrying its cargo of survivors toward home. They stopped at Knossos when the sun was high, all of them too exhausted to continue without rest. The island rose green and gentle from the sea, promising fresh water and solid ground, and a few hours of forgetting. What happened on Knossos has been told in many ways by many voices, each version layered with its own interpretation of betrayal or divine intervention, or simple human failure. Some say Dionysus himself appeared to Theseus in dreams, demanding that Ariadne be left for the god's own bride. Others say Theseus made a crueler choice, deciding that bringing home a Cretan princess might complicate his heroic narrative. Still others insist it was simple exhaustion and grief that made him forget she was there when the ship departed at dawn. The truth, as always, sits somewhere beneath the songs, and Theseus carried it silently for the rest of his life. What cannot be disputed is that when the black sail ship left Knossos behind, Ariadne remained on its shores, her thread used up, her purpose served. Whether she wept or raged or simply waited for whatever came next, the waves that carried the ship away from her also carried away the certainty of her story. And in his exhaustion, in his grief over what had happened in the maze's heart, in his mind still half tangled in labyrinth passages that didn't quite make sense in daylight, Theseus forgot something else. Something smaller, but infinitely more important. The sails remained black. His father had made him promise, had gripped his shoulders with hands made strong by decades of kingship and soft with love, had extracted an oath that if Theseus survived the maze, he would change the funeral sails to white, so that Aegeus would know from the cliffs that his son still lived. It was such a small thing, a simple task. Change the sails. Let hope fly visible across the water before the ship reached harbor. But small things forgotten can carry the weight of worlds. Athens waited on its shore as the black sail ship approached, growing larger against the horizon. On the cliffs above the harbor, an old king stood watching, as he had stood every day since his son departed, scanning the sea for the sign that would tell him whether to prepare celebration or mourning. The black sails told him everything he needed to know. They say King Aegeus stood very still for a moment, understanding washing over him like a wave. His son was gone. The tribute had claimed another generation. Athens would continue, but Athens was suddenly unbearable without the young man who had insisted on volunteering, who had refused to let others die in his place. What thoughts passed through the old king's mind in that final moment, none can say. Perhaps he thought of Theseus as an infant learning to walk on palace floors. Perhaps he thought of advice given and ignored, of warnings about heroism's true cost. Perhaps he thought nothing at all, his grief too vast for the small container of thought. King Aegeus stepped forward off the cliff edge and fell toward the water below. The sea that had carried his son away now received the father's body with the same indifference it showed to all who entered it. The waves closed over him without ceremony, and when they pulled back, the king was gone. The sea would carry his name forever after. The Aegean, they would call it. A father's grief made geography. By the time Theseus's ship entered the harbor, by the time he remembered with sudden horror the promise he had forgotten, Athens was already mourning. The city received him not as a hero who had ended the tribute, but as the new king who had killed his father through carelessness. Victory and tragedy arrived together, as they so often do, twins that cannot be separated no matter how much the poets try. Theseus would rule Athens for many years after, would marry and lead and make the decisions that kings must make. But he never quite forgot the weight of the labyrinth, the sorrow in the Minotaur's eyes, or the black sails that should have been changed to white. Some victories, he learned, cost more than their worth. And some monsters are not the ones that live in mazes. In Crete, the labyrinth stood silent beneath Knossos, its purpose served, its center empty at last. The passages twisted on through darkness, patient and eternal, outlasting everyone who had built them, suffered in them, or died within their depths. Rain fell through the opening in the center chamber where moonlight used to paint everything silver, washing away the last traces of what had happened there. Years became decades, became centuries. Knossos itself eventually crumbled, great palace collapsing into ruin, its frescoes fading, its throne room filling with dust and broken pottery and the quiet weight of time. But beneath it all, the labyrinth remained, carved too deep to collapse entirely, too well built to simply vanish. They say that even now, when moonlight falls just right through cracks in the earth, you can still hear something in those passages. Not quite breathing, not quite voice, just a sound that suggests presence, memory, the ghost of something that was never quite monster nor quite man, but tragically both. If these ancient passages have drawn you gently toward rest tonight, perhaps you'll return tomorrow to walk other mythic roads with Olympus dreams, where more stories wait in shadow. Like and subscribe if you find comfort in these old sorrows, for the gods have countless tales yet to whisper. And as you drift now into your own dreams, know that some mazes are meant not to trap us, but to transform us, to teach us that monsters and heroes are often made by the same hands, the same choices, the same small forgotten promises that change everything. The labyrinth remembers it all, patient as stone, judging nothing, waiting in darkness for the next soul who needs to wander its passages and discover what waits at the center, not death perhaps, but understanding.